Elise Kimmerling Wittschafter is professor of history at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. She's the author of 6 books on military, social, and cultural history, and some of her recent publications include Russia's Age of Serfdom, 1649 to 1861, Religion and Enlightenment in Katerinian Russia, the Teachings of Metropolitan Platon, and Church and Society in Modern Russia, Essays in Honor of Gregory Fries. So that's a sampling of some of her work. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and a recipient of the Provost Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Creative Activity. She's been a visiting professor at the École Hautes Études en Sciences in Paris and at the National Research University of Economics in Moscow. And she's working currently on a book on Russian diplomacy after the defeat of Napoleon. So we're really honored to have Elise here with us, and join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. So today you're getting some social history, which isn't always the most interesting. You know, it can be a little tedious, but it's important to go through all of the variables, factors, and structures. So I want to begin when we hear the word serfdom. Oh, I guess I need to. I'm not used to this part. Okay. When we hear the word serfdom, or bondage actually is another translation for the Russian term, which is krepostnichestvo. Those terms evoke images of rigidity, immobility, stagnation, and oppression. But in the work of social and legal historians since World War II, we see that in Imperial Russia, while these chains of bondage were very much part of social reality and they undergirded the entire social and political system, within the bondage, the system of serfdom, it was still possible to achieve social mobility, entrepreneurial success, and effective access to judicial institutions. So this was for the serfs too, okay? So to illustrate the dynamism and the flexibility of Russian serfdom and of social arrangements in Imperial Russia more generally, I'm going to focus on 4 aspects of peasant life, and I may have to do a little editing so that we have enough time for discussion, but we'll start with family and community, then we'll talk about economic development, then the relationship of peasants to legal administrative institutions, and then finally we'll end with a discussion of Peasant Rebellion, and particularly Peasant Revolution in 1905 and 1917. In the Russian context, one thing it's important to point out, it's difficult to talk about serfs without talking about peasants in general and peasant agriculture more generally. So while I will be talking about serfdom, I'm also talking about peasant society as a whole, or peasant communities. The last census in Imperial Russia before the Emancipation of 1861 classified only about half of Russian peasants as privately owned serfs, and slightly fewer as state peasants. The state peasants also included the former church peasants, which had been confiscated from the church in the late 18th century. There was another smaller group called crown peasants, about 4% of the peasant population, peasants who belonged to the dynasty directly, to the royal family. So there are a lot of differences in legal classifications when we look at Russian peasants. There also are significant regional and environmental distinctions, and I will not have time to get into those today, but that's something just to keep in mind and to know that you need to be aware of if you want to go more deeply into this subject. So if we're talking about serfdom, then, there are the statistics. Okay, I forgot to, sorry about that. You can see that. Okay, so if we're talking about serfdom as something distinct from peasant society in general, then one of the main differences, it's not so much in how peasants lived or how they organized their communities, but in the fact that serfdom created a sphere of authority and also of abuse, you could say, between the peasant community and the bureaucracy. So state peasants would have been in direct relationship to local bureaucracy, whereas serfs had went through the landlord. Their interface with the government was through the landowner. So in general, non-serfs or state peasants enjoyed a greater degree of freedom than privately owned serfs, but the basic features of peasant life were the same for all of these categories. So I'll distinguish serfdom when it's important. Otherwise, we're talking about general peasant society in general. State and crown peasants, for example, did not owe dues or provide any labor for the landowner, but they still served the state. They paid taxes. All peasants paid taxes. All peasants performed what could be called feudal dues or fulfilled feudal dues. And the basic features of peasant life were similar for all of these groups. They provided labor for public works, and they performed military service as well, whether or not they were serfs. All right, so as I said, instead of highlighting these legal and institutional differences, I'm going to focus on the shared cultural features, cultural and community features of peasant life. All right, so we're going to go from the bottom up in the tradition of social history. The basic unit of the peasant community was the patriarchal household. The head of the household was usually the eldest adult male. Sometimes women were also heads of households. Usually a woman head of household would be a widow who had sons, who would then, when they came of age, become the head of the household. The heads of households voted in a village assembly. The village assembly was responsible for administering land redistributions, something I'll come back to, collecting taxes and dues based on the principle of collective responsibility, another important principle I'll come back to, and selecting conscripts during recruitment levies. Collective responsibility meant that the entire community was responsible for the payment of dues, the payment of taxes, and the providing of recruits. So in other words, the government did a census of male souls, they were called, and based on the number of male souls in each community, taxes would be assigned, the amount of taxes that the community owed, the number of recruits that had to be delivered during a levy, and those obligations were collectively fulfilled. So if there happened to be a household that could not meet its obligations, the entire community was responsible for making up the difference. And that would be the case also in the providing of labor to the landowner and the providing the payment of feudal dues to the landowner as well. All right? So we'll come back to the implications of this. It's a very important aspect of peasant life. Gender was also important because Land allocations within the community depended on the number of husband-wife work teams or male children who would eventually become part of the workforce. Gender, specifically the number of male members in a household, also determined, as I said, the tax and conscription obligations. So the land redistributions were handled generally by the village assembly, and periodically, not all communes practiced repartitional land tenure. Some had hereditary land tenure, but in what was called a repartitional commune, periodically the village assembly would come together and they would reallocate the land based on the size of the household, and particularly on the number of these husband-wife work teams. So, this was a practice. Again, it wasn't universal across Russia. There are regional differences, but it was a practice that gave peasant life a collectivistic aura, or made it appear more egalitarian and collectivistic than it actually was. And a lot of Russian intellectuals, particularly socialists and other radicals who became active starting in the 1860s, well, actually earlier, but really with them after Emancipation, 1861, they looked at these practices in peasant society and they assumed that the peasants were naturally socialistic, which in fact they were not. So the way that the land tenure question is important because it also had economic implications. So in order to make sure, the main goal was to make sure that, I think I need to go on now, okay, gender. The main goal was to make sure that each household could meet its obligations. So it was in the interest of the community that every household could pay its dues to the landlord, pay its taxes to the state, and also provide a recruit when it was necessary. So these, what we see as collectivistic practices, were designed to ensure the economic viability of the household by making sure each household had an amount of land, that the amount of land it needed to support its members, and also that the land was used efficiently based on the size of households. Military conscription also was handled, that's another complicated subject that we don't have time to go into, but it was also handled based on the size of the household and the actual number of sons in the household. So a larger family theoretically would be first in line to send a recruit when it came time for the community to make those selections. The other way that this played out was in the strip farming. Most Russian peasants, again, there are a lot of variations. Nothing's universal. Nothing we say about Russian peasants in the 18th or 19th centuries is universal. But most peasants, most of the farming was organized around the 3-field system, where 2 fields would be planted in any given year and 1 field would be left fallow to replenish, to be fertilized. The livestock would be sent there to graze and fertilize the soil. And then, so you had 3 fields basically that a community was working with. And then within the fields that were planted, each household would be allocated a strip. Okay, so the quality of fields might vary. Some were further from the village than others. Some might be closer to water resources or whatever. So the idea was that the economic resources would be allocated according to the labor that the family was capable of performing, and so as to ensure that each family could meet its obligations. So each family would Unlike slavery, where all the slaves went out into the fields, though I don't know much about slavery, so I don't want to say anything too specific about it. But in this case, each family would be responsible for farming its strip. So the allocations would be by the community, but the actual farming would be done by the family. Okay, and then each household might have a little garden that was its own, and livestock that also was its own. All right? Okay, so because of these collectivistic practices, as I said, there was a myth of egalitarianism that developed in 19th century Russia. But it's important to point out that even though these egalitarian practices were real and significant, they did not preclude other types of social relationships that we would describe as hierarchical. They did not preclude social conflict. They did not prevent individuals from working off the farm outside the community and achieving, in some cases, enormous entrepreneurial success through trade or even in manufacturing. They also did not preclude the buying, selling, and renting of private and communal lands. So people could make all sorts of arrangements with their lands, even if they were communal lands, or they might buy some private lands, particularly after emancipation, when the private market in land became much more active and extensive. So you could have a family that survive partly on trade or off-farm work, maybe in a factory that, rented land outside the communal framework, or maybe bought land that wasn't part of the communal framework. There were all sorts of possibilities and opportunities that existed. These opportunities, obviously, they became greater after emancipation, but they were already there in the 18th century before emancipation and in the early 19th century. The other thing about communal practices is, some of us know if we come from extended families or tight communities, communal practices could protect people, but they also could be cruel. And so, members of the community could be ostracized if they were considered to be economically weak, if they were considered disruptive. Maybe, someone had a history of drunkenness or something like that. Troublemakers and people considered troublemakers by the community, and people who were not seen as carrying their weight economically could be eliminated through the conscription process. So even though conscription was supposed to be egalitarian and it was supposed to be based on the number of sons that a peasant household had, sometimes peasant communities, peasant officials, the heads of the households, they would get rid of weaker elements or people they considered troublemakers by sending them off to the army. Yes, it's collectivistic, and there's a lot of mutual support and protection to ensure the economic interests of the community, but there also were mechanisms for getting rid of people who were considered undeserving, so to speak. All right, so it wasn't just what the socialists imagined. It could be very hierarchical and very, very cruel in that sense. Just one additional point about conscription. The conscription obligation in Russia in the 18th century, starting in the reign of Peter I at the beginning of the 18th century, the conscription obligation was for life. So if you were sent off to the army, you became legally free. You were no longer a serf or a state peasant, but you would not be able to leave the army until you were disabled or dead, basically. So there wasn't really It was freedom in a formal legal sense, but it wasn't a free life, so to speak. In 1796, the term of service was changed to 25 years, which is still virtually a lifetime, especially in the conditions of military life that existed at that time. Only in 1873, after the Emancipation of 1861, in 1873, universal conscription is introduced with a reduced term of service, which meant that, men who were sent to the army were more likely to be able to return to their communities and families. Okay, so turning now to the, one thing I forgot to mention about the patriarchal system was that in a patriarchal household, this isn't just in Russia, this is universal, but the wife is expected to be obedient, the children are expected to be obedient. There's a strict hierarchy of age and gender, but at the same time, the head of the household, the patriarch, is expected to take care of his family and the members of the household. So there is a sense of kind of mutual obligation and obedience by subordinates, but obligations that the patriarch fulfilled. Okay, so if we turn now to economic development, there we go. As we find in discussions of U.S. slavery, and there are heated debates about the economic viability of serfdom and of post-emancipation peasant agriculture more generally. In general, both before and after emancipation, the peasant economy can be described as dynamic, resilient, adaptable, and at times innovative. So, as I mentioned before, Russian serfs either worked for the landowner or they paid dues. But the thing about serfdom was that they always enjoyed a right of land usage to meet their own needs. So while part of the land was worked for the landowner, but then part of the land belonged to the commune, and the peasants worked that land for themselves. In addition, and this is a really important point when we're looking at post-emancipation systems or developments, in Russia, emancipation, unlike in the United States, was emancipation with land. The peasants did have to pay for that land. They had to pay special taxes to redeem the land, but they were guaranteed land, and so their communities were left intact and even reinforced after the emancipation. The government was committed to the peasant community, the peasant commune, believed it was an important source of stability, and so everything was done to bolster the commune, rather than undermine it as a result of emancipation. I mentioned already the off-farm work. Again, before and after emancipation, peasants also could be involved in trade and manufacturing, including specialized handicraft production. There were villages that became known for specific products that they produced, and there was factory production. So we have this phenomenon in Russian serfdom of what we call serf entrepreneurs, and these were serfs who got permission from the landowner to go off and make their fortune. And of course, it benefited the landowner, the wealthier they became. So we even had so-called serf millionaires, people who made a fortune in trade all over the empire. Serfs who actually ended up being factory owners. I mean, they didn't own the factories legally. They owned them in the name of the master, but they were actually the owner, and they would employ other serfs. So all these possibilities existed even within this framework of serfdom, and that's why it's important to recognize how dynamic and flexible the system was. Migration to towns and to other centers of manufacturing and these off-farm employment, all of this became more significant after emancipation, when it became easier for peasants to leave the village and go off and work elsewhere. But at the same time, and especially starting in the 1880s, when Russia began to industrialize in a significant way, there were more opportunities for off-farm work in the new factories. But again, even though all these possibilities existed, it did not mean that peasants necessarily broke their ties to the village. And that's one of the debates in Russian history. You know, to what extent did the peasants who went to work in these factories become proletarians in the Marxist sense, you know, become conscious workers? To what extent did they remain tied to their peasant identities and relationships? One of the interesting things is that after the revolution of 1917, when the monarchy was gone and the Bolsheviks had come to power and civil war rages for a few years, a lot of peasants or workers who were in the cities working in factories went back to their home communities. So clearly, people saw these village communities as a place of refuge. And in a time of crisis, and you know, when the cities were starving, people could go back to these communities and provide for themselves or reconnect with their families, that sort of thing. So it's interesting that the revolution actually reinforced the strength of the commune and the ties of the peasants to the commune. And that's why, if you've taken some Soviet history, that's why eventually when the Bolsheviks decide that they've got to collectivize agriculture in order to develop a modern industrial economy, they have to subject the peasants to incredible violence and coercion to break up those communities. They have to force them out of those communities because the peasants are, you know, they're happy with their life and their communities in a sense. The communities meet their needs and the needs of their families. Okay, so that brings us then to the question of this we've already talked about. Oh, well, not exactly. The question of the crisis, the so-called crisis in the countryside. What happens after emancipation that allows us to understand the revolution, both of 1905 and then again in 1917. Two revolutions in which the peasants were very important, played an important role, and were clearly in rebellion in a massive way. All right, so there's a lot of debate, ongoing debate about how did the peasants do after emancipation? You know, how did they fare economically in the decades after emancipation and before the revolution? So this is where Russia has one of her standard of living debates, which, you know, is one of those questions that gets asked in all sorts of contexts usually when historians are describing the process of industrialization and how people are uprooted and certain professions or occupations become anachronistic or no longer viable. Okay, so the traditional way of viewing the post-emancipation order in the countryside was to stress the crisis of the countryside, and this was something that came from the Marxists. Lenin wrote a lot about it, and it fit the narrative of explaining the revolution and why the Bolsheviks had been successful in the revolution. But in recent decades, historians, who have been focusing on local conditions have pretty much discredited any idea that there was generalized crisis or generalized impoverishment in the countryside. Now, that doesn't mean that all was well, or that the peasants were living, that their expectations were being met. So I want to turn now to the question of peasant discontent, which doesn't begin after emancipation. It's something that's part of the history of serfdom. It's been there since the beginning. So before emancipation, peasants might rebel against abusive masters when they thought that their masters were demanding excessive dues, or when they thought that they were being punished, that unjustified punishments were being imposed on them. And we see this actually in military service, which is one of the areas I've worked on, where the soldiers came from the peasantry. Serfs generally, I believe, accepted their lot, at least outwardly. There were large-scale rebellions in the 17th and 18th centuries, but on the whole, the system of serfdom and peasant society and how it connected to the political arrangements, in general, stability was the norm, and peasants would object, they would rebel when they thought when their expectations were not met or when they thought they had been abused. The government and the landowners did not tolerate any kind of rebellion. Troops could be sent in to suppress the rebellion, but sometimes landowners would negotiate with their peasants because it was really in the interest of the master that his peasants not be unhappy, that they be doing their work. His interests and theirs were similar in that regard. Okay, so after emancipation, peasants, even though the emancipation was an emancipation with land, and even though historians have documented that the government and the officials who implemented the emancipation made a good faith effort to be fair and to address the different interests, the interests of the landowners as well as of the peasants. The peasants were not happy with the terms of the land settlement. So they did not think they had received a fair share of land resources. And they also believed that the redemption payments that were imposed on them to pay for the land were not legitimate. So the peasant view was that the land belonged to God. It was a gift from God, and whoever tilled the soil owned the land. So they didn't share our Western notions of property ownership or property rights. So again, from our perspective, the land settlement looks pretty good, especially if you compare it to something like the emancipation in the United States. But from their perspective, it was unfair, and they expected a better deal, so to speak. So after the emancipation process was begun, and it was a long process that took decades to reach its conclusion, almost immediately expectations of a second, more just settlement arose. So there was this belief or assumption that there would be another settlement. This wasn't the real settlement, that something else was coming. Eventually, the peasants' expectation of a more just settlement undermined their belief in the goodness and good intentions of the monarch. So as I mentioned, in the revolutions of 1905 and 1917, peasant rebellion played a major role in bringing down the monarchy and in destroying established authority. Peasant anger especially was directed against provincial nobles and that anger led to, in some cases, the seizure of private estates and the murders of local landowners. All right, so there is an expectation, what sometimes historians refer to as land hunger. And that issue was out there from the beginning. Another source of discontent, or another pressure on peasants, was just, agriculture is difficult. An agricultural economy is subject to the ravages of nature, crop failures, production crises, the dangers of malnutrition, and sometimes famine, disease, and epidemics. So in Russia, before and after serfdom, these crises tended to be local or regional. They weren't usually across the whole empire. For example, the Middle Volga provinces suffered famine and cholera in 1891-92, and then another period of small harvests hit that same region in 1905-1908. So the problem here was that the relief efforts by the government were not particularly effective, and so in the late 19th century, in the post-emancipation period, when relief was not effectively mobilized, the unhappiness or the continuation of the suffering had political implications, and intellectuals and people active in Russian public life, as well as peasants, would start to blame the government for these crises. Another problem, economic problem that affected Russian agriculture was the situation with global grain prices after 1875. So this was a time when the United States started to export significant amounts of grain after our Civil War, and that impacted prices in the world market. It affected Russian agriculture. So at a time when Russian peasants they were paying redemption payments, the cost of renting land was going up. They were also getting less for the products that they were sending to market because of this global market situation. All right, so that was a real economic pressure that affected them and affected their understanding of the land question. During all of this time, despite the pressures and the discontent, there was still a lot of dynamic economic change. So again, you have to look at it locally, and we are far, far from having done all the research and all the necessary places. I mean, really, it would take an army of researchers, working for I don't know how many decades to get all the information that we would need to have a complete picture of how peasants were faring in the Russian Empire after emancipation. And that's probably never going to happen. So, we kind of have to just be aware of the different possibilities. But there are a lot of peasant communities, depending on regions, depending on soil quality, depending on their closeness to urban markets or to transportation hubs. There are a lot of communities that are actually modernizing their way of farming. They're experimenting with different types of crops. Mainly Russian peasant agriculture was a grain-based economy. But there are places where there's crop diversification in response to market demands. There are places, we have this general picture that the communal institutions and the way of organizing the communal lands represented a drag on innovation because decision making had to be collective, and because of the strip farming, so there were certain innovation, a certain drag on innovation that historians generally associate with these communal institutions, but again, it's not necessarily the case. Probably overall, it made innovation less difficult to achieve because there had to be a collective decision. But it didn't prevent change. And as I mentioned before, some peasants are, in addition to their communal lands, they're also farming rented lands or lands that they've purchased privately. So I just want to emphasize the dynamism that's out there despite these areas of discontent and the economic pressures. So in general, and again, this is always true in an agricultural setting, there's a lot of insecurity and unpredictability that just comes with that type of work. Okay, so the last thing I want to do then is turn to focus on how the developments in peasant society and economy relate to political arrangements and political institutions. Okay, so again, going back to serfdom, the Russian legal order mainly governed the peasants' relationship to the state, particularly the service and tax obligations that peasants owed. Relations between the master and serf were only sporadically regulated, and most of what went on within households and village communities remained untouched by formal law. So you had a certain amount of judicial, community justice, so to speak. You had relations and negotiations between masters and peasant communities, and you find some of this in Russian literature. If you've read Anna Karenina, you've come across that problem of the landlord trying to introduce innovations and meeting up with peasant resistance. So some of the recent scholarship, which I think is really interesting, emphasizes all of the different arrangements that peasants made with masters, to the point where some people are saying, well, maybe we shouldn't even use the word serfdom, because there are so many different arrangements that different peasants make with different landowners, and it's almost a contractual system, a contract between the master and his own serfs. So that's one of the newer areas of discussion, and it's connected with a more global view. I'm sure you're all being introduced to or encouraged to think about history more globally and to think in terms of global history or world history. And so some of the recent really interesting work on Russian serfdom is really using this term bondage instead of serfdom and placing Russian serfdom in the context of relations of labor bondage that existed on a global scale, and that could include serfdom, slavery, indentured servitude, not just one or the other, but all bondage, all forms of bondage. And then that's being connected to the development of global capitalism, that sort of thing. So I'm not that well versed on all of the economics of those questions. All right, so getting back to our Russian peasants, there was a lot of what we call discretionary authority in the Russian system. Discretionary authority on the part of the landowner, on the part of peasant village elders, or elected peasant officials at the very local level, and discretionary authority on the part of local officials, who would be the first point of contact between the peasants and the government. But even with this very broad-based discretionary authority, peasants still had the ability to appeal to higher authorities for redress of grievances. So in the village context, if the village elder or some peasant official appointed by the landowner or elected by the peasants was abusing his authority, then they would appeal to the landowner. It was possible to appeal against the landowner to local officials and to higher authorities. So Russia has a long tradition, a very interesting history that isn't related just to peasants, of petitioning and the culture of petitioning. And that was something people believed existed. They made use of it. The results, from what we can tell, were fairly meager, but enough people got results to keep the myth alive. And we often refer to it as the myth of the Tsar. The idea that if you could get to the Tsar, if you could get to the higher authority, your grievances would be addressed. That the problem was more the local official on the ground, or the landowner, but not the higher authority. And so there was this belief in the myth of the Tsar, and that belief was an important aspect of monarchism in Russian society. And remember, peasants were 80 to 90% of the population. So when we talk about Russian society, we're mainly talking about peasants. Though obviously there are a lot of other interesting groups too. The possibility of making use of judicial institutions was there, and it was real. It also, to my mind, illustrates the importance of moral expectations in Russian social arrangements. So it's one of the questions I'm interested in, both in Russian social relationships and in political culture. The use or the importance of moral principles and moral expectations in regulating social behavior. Whether it's the behavior of the subjugated or oppressed group, or whether it's the behavior of the person exercising authority. The political language is very much a language of morality, and abuses were seen traditionally not as systemic abuses, but more as the moral failings of the individual. Whether it's the landowner or the regimental commander or the local official. Okay, so one of the things that happens, turning to the, because I want to leave time for discussion. You said it's
about 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. All right. So the access to judicial institutions is very important. It becomes more significant again after emancipation, because there are important judicial reforms that take place as part of the Great Reforms, and also because the peasant communal institutions become more institutionalized, you could say, and the landlord's authority is removed. So you have, you have communal justice, and you have local peasant courts that become available, in addition to the other courts that peasants have been using or can get access to in some situations. So when we're talking, when we turn to the question of resistance and what happened, how do we explain this revolution, these revolutions, and the role that peasants played in these revolutions? As I said before, large-scale, local and violent, local rebellion and large-scale rebellion had been characteristic of Russian serfdom since the 17th century, at least since the origins of the serf system. So we have that in the history. We also have what historians refer to as, or this comes from a political scientist, I think he's a political scientist, John Scott, forms of everyday resistance, where, kind of passive resistance, where you don't work quite so hard, or you take a long break, that kind of thing. You're not openly being disobedient, but you're resisting through your the way you do your work, so to speak. So all of this is there before emancipation and after. So then the question, and there is this tradition of demanding redress, rebelling when you think you've been unjustly punished, or when the demands being made of you are too great. But, there's still this question of why did the peasants rebel against the monarchy in 1905 and 1917? If the Emancipation settlement gave peasants a fair deal, and if, as recent scholarship maintains, the peasant economy was dynamic and able to adapt to the emerging industrial economy, why is it that the peasants repeatedly rose up against the late imperial government and the rural social order? So this is the question that I think is still out there. I don't think the question has been adequately answered. I have a few ideas or suggestions or thoughts about what I think happened. One thing that I think happened is that after the landlord's authority was removed, peasants increasingly came face to face with the government. The government had been pretty removed or remote, but as the state became more bureaucratic, the intrusions into local life became more significant, and the intrusions into community autonomy became more significant. So this is something, as Americans, we're very sensitive to this issue, right, of government intrusions into our families and our communities. So, the peasant communes, had been pretty much left alone as long as they didn't rebel, as long as they paid their taxes and dues, as long as they delivered the recruits. Their internal affairs were pretty much left to the village assembly or to the households to decide. So there's something here about government intrusions into local life. And this becomes particularly intense during World War I. So I think, World War I is critical in explaining the Russian Revolution and what happened to the peasants, why they turned against the monarchy. All of the economic stresses and the social injustices that they have traditionally experienced become intensified during the war. There's also the burden of conscription, which becomes much more onerous, and just the overall economic hardship, which tips the scale. And then finally, there's the loss of belief in the Tsar's good intentions, and that happens. One of the critical moments, or the critical moment, is the Bloody Sunday in January 1905, which triggers the revolution of 1905, and that's the point, I think, where Russians cease to be monarchists, where they cease to believe that the monarch is there to protect them. That opens things up. And then, of course, there are a million. We're not going to talk about the Russian Revolution, but there's just this question out there of if this peasant economy is so dynamic and capable of adapting, and if the Emancipation settlement is more or less fair, then why is it that the peasants turn against the monarchy, which clearly they do? All right, so I'll stop there, and let's see, did I have another? I kept forgetting that we went over. Okay, so that's the end. All right. Thank you.
Great, we have time for questions.
Was there any indication before the revolution of the higher authority, government, or any authority, controlling the resources of food or grain, like might have happened or happened in Ukraine under the Soviet rules?
You mean before, like during the war? Or?
Well, even in between like 1861 and the revolution under that.
I mean that.
More global. I mean, some of the things you have with the crisis in the countryside, you know, you talked about it being more, potentially more local. So was there
Right.
anything more global in terms of our, across that country?
You mean the idea that the government would manipulate the No, I don't. I think that's a Soviet. Yeah, because this government the imperial government had very limited effective authority in this vast land space. You know, it was so when unlike the Soviet system, the imperial system is generally characterized as being, you know, Russia as being under-governed, under-institutionalized, and that's why there was so much arbitrariness, or could be so much arbitrariness at the local level, because so much was left to that local discretionary authority, and so that's why you don't ever see kind of effective law and order, so to speak, because the central government, however well-intentioned, or however busy passing legislation, could never really get it down to the community level. So, you're welcome.
So what was the relationship with the local government and landowners to the Tsar? You said they were collecting all this revenue. Were they passing it along to the Tsar?
Yeah, so it would kind of go up. Everything went up the...
So as long as they kept sending checks to the Tsar, he never came to...
Or cash, yeah. So you know, really the state was remote, you know, and removed, and there's a lot of discussion in Russian history about corruption, you know, official corruption, administrative corruption, that sort of thing. So, you know, at every level, it's just not an efficient system. It's not a well-regulated system. You know, it's pretty amorphous, and so that's why, you know, what happens locally in the immediate circumstances is so important. Just to give you an example, like one of the things I've worked on is I read a lot of court-martial records from the Russian army, you know, so what would happen is there would be some sort of disturbance or disorder in a regiment, and the soldiers would claim, you know, the commander didn't give us our rations, or didn't give us our pay, or this or that, or he was cruel, or he punished someone unjustly, you know, and you see these things in peasant relationships too with landowners. And, you know, what would end up happening in the court-martial is the soldiers would be punished for their disobedience, because that's not tolerated, you know, and then the officers would be punished for neglect of duty. So it was kind of this, you know, egalitarian punishment of everyone, so to speak. You know, there was a certain egalitarianism in punishing all parties considered responsible for some sort of disturbance. And that's how that protected the Tsar. You know, that kind of kept the myth of the Tsar alive, right? That, the Tsar doesn't know about this. You know, if he knew or she knew, then this wouldn't be happening. So, you know, that's what people believed. Yes?
You mentioned the myths of egalitarianism.
Uh-huh.
But yet it seems to me at the lower level, there was the arrangement ensured some minimum level of survival.
Well,
At the lower level.
yeah.
So in other words, nobody will be left out. Nobody will be starving, I suppose. the lower level, the community will
Mm-hmm.
ensure that there's a minimum level of survival.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, at the lower level, there was some egalitarian.
Yeah, there is some, but again, it's not. So I mentioned the hierarchy within communities and the removal of people who were considered undeserving. So yes, there's a willingness to provide support for widows and children and, the deserving poor. If you're whatever, you lose your livestock in a fire or your house burns, there's definitely this community support. But then there also is community cruelty, and ostracism when people are considered undeserving of that support. So if you're considered a drunkard or if you're considered to be lazy, whatever it is, in the way you work, then, they didn't want you in the community. So it really, the community interest is paramount. And so sometimes that works for the family and for the individual, but not always. So that's how I would describe it. But it's, again, there's a lot of variation.
Throughout, I did not hear the word incentives.
Incentives for...
In our
Yeah,
system,
right.
in our system, we pride ourselves on a market economy, individualism,
Right.
it encourages incentives.
No, this is all about obligation,
Here,
right? Right? Or
incentive,
You said that it was flexible and that people would go into the city to make money.
well, that's true. There's an entrepreneurial spirit. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There is another side to this, but the stability of the system that is provided by the fact that there is a hierarchy that it has established and the rules that are assigned and everybody knows their place in the system. And this is great because there's no crisis of authority, there is no crisis of identity, there is no crisis of role. The man has his job, and if he doesn't do his job, he's ostracized. The woman knows his job, and this is, whatever. The
Yeah.
children have to work and whatnot. So when you do have the revolutionary events that, that are coming, this structure is destroyed. There's no more families or communities that actually could provide protection. And for the younger people, they found, I've thought, much more exciting life elsewhere and the opportunities, and there's no real reason for them to stay. They can go and, join
You're
the
talking about
revolution.
after emancipation.
Yeah,
or-
after the revolution
Oh,
of
after-
1905 and 1917,
Yeah, yeah.
like my grandfather, for example, who was the son of the priest, he just ran away from home and he was 17 because there was nothing
Yeah.
there and he wanted to become like the world explorer, and which
So
in
there
fact,
was more
in fact he
opportunity
did.
after.
But for the weaker people,
Mm-hmm.
the protection of the community was the incentive. Because you're not alone. In the city, you're alone. You're not surrounded, you have no support.
And another thing that happened, of course, is the wage Armstrong, which you didn't have time to cover.
Right.
This was an idea to allow them to leave the commune, and many people took advantage of that. And so that was also beginning to change the countryside, but that was only in the 1970s.
Yeah.
How much of the population is living in the countryside and how much is in the urban centers? I mean,
That's
you
a
didn't
good
really.
question, because the statistics are based on your legal classification. So that's the problem. It's not based on occupation. I mean, there may be some city statistics that show you occupational breakdowns, but the national censuses, which were used, for conscription and tax, those are you belong to one of these legal categories. So legally you could be a peasant or a serf, but you still could be an entrepreneur. So the legal classification doesn't necessarily match the social reality, and what is recorded is the legal classification, because that's how the taxes are calculated, or the conscription obligation.
The
So-
records don't adequately show
how much, well, right, or how much, nor does it show. So Alice mentioned the wager on the strong, and I would just add, well, or what Katya said, that, you know, all this activity was going on before emancipation too. It's just, it increases after emancipation, because when you have industrialization and urbanization, there's more opportunity for off-farm work, but the basic pattern of going off the farm temporarily or, you know, indefinitely, it's there already in the 18th century. But you're still, as far as the statistics go, you're still a serf. Right, or a peasant. But you, so yeah, so that's why, you know, it's a lot of this can't really be measured. And you have to look at what's going on in a local community or on one estate. You know, that's where the research has been, and of course that's just one place.
But the revolutions, uprising, rebellions, I mean, that's mostly occurring in urban centers.
Well, not really. No. So traditionally, it's local rebellions in the countryside. The peasant, both in 1917 and 1905, there are rural. It's a rural revolution. There also is revolution in the capitals, and that's probably what's decisive ultimately, you know, in deciding the outcome in 1917 and allowing the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power. But that's why when you study the Civil War period, you know, people talk about now the Reds, the Whites, and the Greens. The Greens were the peasants who didn't really identify either with the Bolsheviks or with the monarchists. You know, they were trying to protect their communities and their way of life, and they basically fought anyone who came through, and they all came through ravaging their communities, you know, confiscating their food supplies and killing their people. So it was a pretty grim. And have you ever read Bobbles like Red Cavalry? It describes that situation, you know, and so the peasants were out there just trying to protect themselves, their communities, their way of life, and you know, the Bolsheviks came out on top. They were the more ruthless and the better organized, but they had to fight the peasants, you know. So, and then eventually they had to destroy them. They had to destroy their communities, which is what they did with collectivization.
Have you ever thought of doing a comparative study between this and I can think of enormous parallels and similarities between you know, rural arrangements in India and Pakistan and the village.
Well, that's what I was mentioning in some of the new research that focuses on bondage as opposed to serfdom per se, but on, you know, forms of labor bondage globally. Yeah. There is some, if the person who's been publishing with that more global perspective that includes, I think, some work in India or some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, his name is Stanziani, if you're interested in that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Many years ago, I was in that part of the world, and here I go to a village, and there's a friend sitting there having lunch, and then somebody comes along, that, why are you on my land? And says, look,
this is where we live.
I said, who are you? He says, I own this village. He owned this village, and so he had a right to kind of question me why what I was doing.
Where was this in India?
Yeah, it was a part of it.
Yeah.
So the same kind of master-serf relationship, you know, the ownership and the arrangement and the
different types of
there
connections.
are parallels, enormous parallels.
Yeah.
The nomenclature may be different, but the parallels are there.
Yeah, well, that's what this new research is trying to highlight.
It's happening in labor history too. You have the global history, labor history.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to get your arms around it all, right? It's
and to actually determine what the terms mean. Like you're saying, sort of, what is a worker? What is a peasant? We don't know.
Thank you again.
No, we don't know. I know less and less.
The
as
more you
time-
know, the less you know.
I-